Hello, we are ready to start the next session on the book of Daniel. And this is our week 8 or our session number 8. We're looking at chapter 8. And so here we go. Book of Daniel. We've looked at chapter 1 and have remarked that the first chapter has the youths who go to Babylon refusing to eat from the king's table and asking instead for vegetables, not vegetables. They ask for seeds and water. Um, they use an unusual vocabulary word there. Most translations say vegetables, but it's a word for seeds. And so I think it's supposed to trigger our idea that that God is doing a new planting. Chapter 2 was the Nebuchadnezzar statue, which is that idea is repeated as we saw last time in chapter 7 with the 4 world empires. Chapter 3 is a contest of worship. Chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's final stage of his conversion as he becomes a beast and then a man. Chapter 5, the last night of Belshazzar, as Cyrus Persia, Cyrus the Mede, Darius the Mede, Cyrus the Persian are at the gate and ready to take over Babylon's last night. Then chapter 6, we saw Daniel in the lion's den. And chapter 7, last time we looked at the beast empires, which echo chapter 2's statue, the 4 phases of world history. Today we're going to look at chapter 8, the goat and the ram. This is another interesting part and it's the first, we're coming back to the Hebrew section. If you look at the chart here of the book of Daniel, there's Hebrew in chapter 1, and then the Hebrew goes away and doesn't come back until this chapter in chapter 8. And so the Hebrew section kind of looks at things from Israel's point of view. It's looking at things in the language of Israel, God's people. But then it's suspended for a while because chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic, which is the empire language. So we're looking again, but here we're looking in chapter 8, we're looking at empire kinds of things, world history kind of things, but we're looking at them from the Hebrew point of view. So when we look at the little horn, it's going to seem big and seem whatever because it's right up close to Israel. It's going to be it's a big thing for them from their point of view. So we're looking at the lion, bear, leopard, and 4th empires, but we're looking at bear and leopard as ram and goat from the Hebrew point of view. So we're here in Belshazzar's 3rd year. It might be his last year. It doesn't say. It is his 3rd year, and we've come almost up equal then with chapter 5, which is his very last of his last year when he sees the handwriting on the wall. And then, of course, all these last chapters happen after a long period, decades of silence. Daniel, the young man, is there during the first 4 chapters, but then there's a gap. Nebuchadnezzar dies, Jerusalem is destroyed, Cyrus and Babylon declines, and then Cyrus comes to conquer, and all those things happen during some decades of kind of silence in this for this particular book. So we begin Daniel chapter 8. Let's read here. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the capital, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns. Both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward, northward, and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. So Belshazzar is still king of Babylon. We don't know exactly how close we are to his last year in 539 when the Persians take over under Cyrus Darius. But it has been 2 years since chapter 7. And then we see this in this vision, a ram and a goat. And the vision has nothing to do with Babylon. The ram is Medo-Persia, and it's specified later in the chapter very clearly. And then the goat also is going to be Greece. We'll see that. A ram has 2 horns. Both horns were high. One was higher than the other. The higher one came up last. This is 1 horn for Media, 1 horn for Persia. Persia superseded Media. It's second, but it's greater, it's higher, it's stronger. And then Medo-Persia is way in the east. If you go farther east, it's just a whole lot of mountains. So if you are an empire of Medo-Persia and you want to conquer things, you don't go towards the mountains where there's just mountains. You go west, north, and south. So it makes sense geographically for them to be like that. Okay, verse 5. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. And then the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. So Persia then becomes challenged and replaced by Greece, this male goat that comes from the west. And this is remarkable now. This is Daniel in 500 whatever, and he's talking about things that are going to happen in 300 something, 200 years in the future. Alexander the Great's world conquest year is 333 BC. So there is when Greece comes on the scene, there is this conspicuous horn, Alexander the Great, and runs the table, and the map is painted a new color from all the way from this side to that side. So that's Alexander. This ram and this goat. Now, notice that we are not talking about bears and lions and eagles anymore. We're talking about rams and goats. These are temple animals. And that and the fact that we're now back in the Hebrew language tells us that we're shifting our perspective. We're still looking at world empires, but we're looking at them from Israel's point of view. So the change in the kinds of animals, even in the vision, has got something to tell us. Well, Alexander the Great, after he conquers the world, he doesn't last long at all. He dies suddenly, and then his empire is divided into 4 pieces. So we talk about the 4 conspicuous horns. These are either the 4 geographic pieces of his empire towards the 4 winds of heaven, north, south, east, and west. And you could also maybe think that these 4 horns are 4 phases of the Greek Empire. So it works a little bit both ways. And so you kind of want to hold that loosely. I don't think it's necessary to, tie yourself to one idea or the other. Now, out of one of these 4 horns, there came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, towards the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it, together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. Wouldn't you like to know what that means? Well, one of the 4 pieces of Alexander's empire can be seen as, or it becomes, or devolves into Rome, the Roman Republic, before Julius Caesar, the Western piece of Alexander's empire. This is the legs of iron. It's the fourth beast, and the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire kind of overlap. Greece kind of decreases as Rome is increasing the west. So there's no like handwriting on the wall moment when the Persians take over Babylon. There is no year of conquest when Greece takes over from Persia. Greece then continues, and these four pieces, the north, south, east, and west pieces of Greece, kind of continue and squabble with each other and go into sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker. And as those four pieces kind of decline, Rome, one of the pieces of the west, gets stronger and stronger and stronger, and finally then becomes the fourth beast, and that fourth empire establishes itself. So the legs of iron, the fourth beast, begins after the Republic, and the 10 emperors begin. And the little horn, I'm going to continue to say these are the Herods. They begin in the time of the Roman Republic, before it's really an empire. So it's Rome is still kind of phasing in while Greece is fading out. Herod the Great makes his deals with Rome. He's an opportunist. He's a politician. He's working his cloakroom deals. And then if you look at the chronology over here, 63 BC, the Roman Pompey conquers Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is now formally under the West, under Rome. 47 BC, Herod becomes provincial governor of Galilee, makes his deal with the Roman Senate, whoever's in charge in Rome. 44 BC, Julius Caesar, that's when he's assassinated. Caesar he's virtually an emperor. We kind of count him as the first emperor, although he's not formally announced in some ways. He's not quite an emperor, but he's a virtual emperor. And then 41 BC, Herod and his brother Phasael were named tetrarchs. And then 40 BC, the Senate names Herod king of the Jews. And then 37 BC, Herod and Sosius captured Jerusalem for Mark Antony, from the last of the Hasmoneans. So things are still kind of in flux, and so there's some turmoil, there's some confusion. 31 BC, Herod deftly switches from loser Mark Antony to the winner Octavian, where if you want to know that story, go get Shakespeare's play, Antony and Cleopatra. So here we go with that kind of timeline and those kind of things going on. Daniel, 200 plus years before, 300 years before, 400 years before, can't criticize him for not being more specific in talking about the little horn. The Greece as an empire beast was not conquered by Rome in a single decisive battle. Immediately after Alexander the Great in 333 BC, Greece devolved into four pieces. Those four fought one another as well as other enemies, and then Rome gradually grew into a world empire, variously encountering pieces of the Greek Empire. So that's kind of the world history thing that's going on. And if you want to look at this timeline thing here, we've got the Medo-Persian Empire, then the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire is four-way split, and then finally the Roman Empire. And so there's kind of a phase in, phase out from between the Romans and the Greeks. The ram with two horns. It's also the silver part of the statue. It's also the bear from chapter 7 is Medo-Persia. The goat that has the prominent horn is Greece. It's also the brass part of the statue. It's also the leopard from chapter 7. And then Rome is the iron and clay legs. It's the fourth beast in chapter 7. And so the Medo-Persians is when Daniel is there, 605 to 535 or so. Esther is during this time. Nehemiah was during the time of the Medo-Persians. Malachi, the last prophet to write, maybe 440, maybe 420. His date's a little hard to pin down exactly. But then you get Alexander the Great in 333, and that's the end of the Medo-Persians. That's the beginning of the Greeks. And so during the Greek Empire, during the four parts of the Greek Empire. That's when we get the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. There's a huge benefit for biblical studies. Studying the Greek translation, the Septuagint, is a huge benefit to New Testament scholarship, New Testament study. You want to understand how Old Testament vocabulary matches and maps into New Testament vocabulary. There's nothing like using the Septuagint for that kind of bridge theology. Then the Greek Empire, as it goes into the 200s BC, the Greek general Antiochus IV, who was a Seleucid, he's in charge of the Syrian piece, the Seleucid piece of the Greek Empire. And he actually rules the Jews from 175 to 164. And there's because of his rule, there's a successful Jewish revolt. This is where you get the story of the Maccabees. And in the Maccabean revolt, you get rid of Antiochus, but there are a lot of problems that come along with the Maccabees. And one of those is that they take the high priest's office. It's supposed to be a descendant of Aaron, and we're into a Zadokite line here. Zadok and all his descendants are supposed to be high priest. Well, when the Maccabees take over, they kind of take the high priesthood too, and they give it to who they want to. And subsequently, the high priesthood is never properly in the kind of line of descent as it should. The high priesthood is almost like the tearing of the tabernacle in the time of the judges, where the Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines, and the tabernacle is kind of torn apart, not put back together until Solomon's temple, when the Ark is brought back and the whole system can be restored. Here we have the high priest's office, and it's torn. It becomes a political prize. It's a football, and becomes whoever the highest bidder gets to get it from whoever the political boss is at the time. So that's one of the big problems. So Antiochus, though, in this late 2nd century BC time period, he was a cruel tyrant kind of a guy. He banned many Jewish and Samaritan religious practices. If you had possession of the Torah, that was a capital offense. And he burned all the copies of the law that he could find. Sabbaths and feasts were banned. Circumcision was outlawed. Mothers who circumcised their babies were killed along with their families. Ritual sacrifice was forbidden. It's said that an idol of the Olympian Zeus was placed on the altar of the temple, that the Israelites and that the Israelites who were trying not to get killed set up altars to Greek gods and sacrificed unclean animals on them. So it's a terrible time of turmoil and difficulty under Antiochus IV. So for many, Antiochus IV is seized upon as maybe this is the guy that Daniel's talking about. And he does seem to fit into some of the prophecies, and we'll see how that looks in some more detail later here in chapter 8. So that's what's going on in the 2nd century BC. 1st century BC starts to become Rome, and Rome is becoming stronger. Rome conquers Jerusalem in 63. Julius Caesar is assassinated because he becomes the first virtual emperor in 44 BC. For that, you can see Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar and get the details and backstory. And then after years of turmoil and wars, Caesar Augustus becomes an actual emperor in 27 BC. So we're starting the line of the 10 emperors of Rome in the 1st century BC. Okay, let's look at verse 9 now. Out of one of them 4 horns of the Greek Empire, comes a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host, and regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and a host will be given over to it together. with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. It will throw truth to the ground. It will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and the other holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, the giving over of the sanctuary and the host we trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." So what's going on here? I'm going to continue to suggest, and this is what makes most sense to me, that the little horn is Herod. And if that's what's going on, then this throwing down and trampling of the heavenly host is Herod's violence against the temple and its worshipers. From Israel's point of view, Herod is pretty big. He's a big thing, even though he's called here the little horn. Now, and here's where it's also very popular to see this as the Greek general Antiochus Epiphanes, and that's probably partly true at least. Some of this stuff about throwing down the host and suspending the sacrifice in the temple fits with Antiochus very well, and so many people see this as the way to understand that the regular burnt offering being taken away. Many see this as the harsh decree of Antiochus, but it probably also, or maybe even more, points to the tribulation period from 64 to 70. In 64 AD, remember, that's when Nero becomes the first emperor to actually start persecuting Christians. Up until that time, the Roman Empire had been relatively benign towards the church. Didn't take much notice of it. And 64 is also the year that Herod's temple is finally completed in Jerusalem. And both of these events, partly the chaos going on in Rome and the neglect of Jerusalem, the Jews in Jerusalem become fanatic. There's a higher level of nationalistic frenzy in Jerusalem, and in 64, the Romans are looking elsewhere, and so the Jews in Jerusalem begin to can persecute the Christians without any kind of hindrance. So that is kind of the tribulation period as I see it. Now, all language is imprecise, and when you're Daniel prophesying in 500 BC, 500 something BC, and you're talking about something that's going to happen, 400 years later, when a prophecy speaks with some obscurity about the distant future, it's okay. We can understand that. And the difficulty then, though, becomes compounded. Verse 12 is a puzzle for translators. This is how the ESV reads it. Verse 12, "A host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper." So is that talking about the little horn? Is that talking about Antiochus, or could this be Herod? Here's another way to translate that. And a host was given upon the continual through apostasy, and it cast down truth to the land, and it acted and prospered. So the regular burnt offering, you can call that the continual, is because of transgression or through apostasy, and it cast truth to the land, and it acted and it prospered. What's the difference here? It may be here that the host is the illegitimate line of high priests, those who were in power at the time of Christ, controlled by Herod. And they're the ones who seized the priesthood at the time of the Maccabees, remember. And then these are over the morning, the evening, the continual, the sacrifice. And they, with Herod, cast down Jesus the truth at his trial. So this doesn't have to be the suspension of sacrifice, because in Antiochus's time, this could be the illegitimate high priests at the time of the Herods, at the time of Christ, who are over the morning, evening continual and cast down the truth, Jesus at his trial. It's another way to read it. I think that makes some sense. It's worth thinking about. I like that better than some of the alternatives. Okay. So verse 13, I hear this Holy One speaking, how long the transgression that makes desolate. This transgression that makes desolate, in this reading, I'm going to suggest that this is the sin of the religious leaders, that Jesus rebukes in Jerusalem at the temple. I remember in Matthew 23, Jesus gives a series of woes to the religious leaders. They balance the Beatitudes at the beginning. 8 Beatitudes at the beginning, blessed are, blessed are, blessed are. At the end of Matthew 23, woe, woe, woe. And so Jesus' series of woes to the Jewish leaders in Matthew 23. And at the end of this whole list of woes, he says, your house is left to you desolate. Your house, that's the temple we're talking about. He leaves the temple. Jesus walks out of the temple, and he directly goes and gives the Matthew 24 discourse on the coming destruction of the temple at Jerusalem. So your house is left to you desolate. The disciple says, but look at this place. And he says, no, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. And the whole place is going down. So I think that is, to me, that makes a lot of sense. The transgression that makes desolate is the sin of the religious leaders that Jesus rebukes in Jerusalem. Their conviction of Jesus at his trial, their increasing resistance to the church in spite of all the witnesses that God sends them, their frenzied nationalism, and then finally the desolation of the temple. God has left, the glory is gone, and Jesus from heaven sends the Roman army to tear the place down. That's how I understand it. Okay, let's look at, then it talks about the 2,300 evenings and mornings. What about that? 2,300 evenings and mornings, which is 6.3 years. It may be prophetically quoting the 23-year delay or the wait for the restoration of the temple in Jehoash's reign. Look at 2 Kings 12. It recalls the desolation and the suspension of the sacrifice by wicked Queen Athaliah, who was before Jehoash. She had desolated and suspended sacrifice, that wicked queen. So then that happened. That happened for 23 years. So this 2,300 evenings and mornings may be echoing that somehow. So if we look back and think about good King Jehoash and how he restored the temple, then we can also then look ahead and we can look past wicked King Littlehorn, and all the wicked priests, and be confident of an even greater restoration, a new temple, and that new temple, which is the church. How about that? That works for me as well as anything. So verse 15, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, behold, I will make known to you what shall be the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. And as for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. And as for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others rose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. So here again, we've got Daniel unable to understand the vision. Daniel, who is the wise one all the way through the book, and every time anybody has a vision, he's the one that you call and find out what it means. But the rule kind of seems to be here that the guy who gets the vision can't understand it. Whether the vision comes to Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar or even Daniel, you don't get to interpret your own vision. And so this may be, I think it feeds into the idea that Scripture requires 2 witnesses, 2 or 3 witnesses to everything. You don't get to have one witness testimony. And to me, that figures into the way that we regard some of the problems we have with anyone who says, well, the Lord told me, or I had a vision, and it means. You don't get to interpret your own vision. There's a real danger of in kind of one witness prophecy. or that attempts to prophesy, among other problems. So that's first part there. And then down in verse 17, the last part of that verse, he says, "Understand, O man, the vision is for the time of the end." Well, when's the end? It's very common to take this as meaning the end of the world. And so prophecy, uh, um, interpreters, we're looking for a time still future to us. It's the second coming, it's the final judgment. These things are still out there pending. I don't think that that's necessary at all. I think what we're really talking about here is the time of the end of the old creation. It's the old world order. And that's where God had set the Jews as the sanctuary people. They are in God's temple. They are in the center of the world. And that world ends when Christ does his work. And that world ends and it finally disappears completely in 70 AD, 1,000 years after Solomon's temple was completed in 930 BC. The 1,000 years of the temple, physical temple, is over. And all reality profoundly changes when a man ascends into the Holy of Holies in heaven and is next to God. What more do you need a temple for? Why do you need a sanctuary people? There is no more office or purpose for Israel. The old schematic of the world is over. And now we all have access to the throne of grace. We all in Christ can go through the veil and be accepted before God's mercy seat. That's the end. This is the time of the end. And we're going to end the way the world used to be organized. And we're into the new creation. I have made all things new. So that's how I read that verse. Verse 20, the ram is Media and Persia. Verse 21, the goat is the king of Greece. We've already said this is Greece, the four parts, the four phases that follow Alexander. And then four others arose. And then the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men, and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand. And in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many. And he shall even rise up against the Prince of Princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. Who are we talking about here? Well, no surprise. I keep coming back to the idea that the little horn, this last guy, this is Herod. We're speaking Hebrew now. We're looking at these world empires from Israel's perspective, and everything about this king of the bold face, you know, when the guy who's closest to you looks the biggest, and that's Herod. Everything that you say about this little horn fits one way or the other with Herod and the Herods. He understands riddles. Herod could figure out his way through any political puzzle and come out on top. He knew how to work things. He knew how to get himself appointed. His power was great, but not his own. Well, yeah, he becomes king of the Jews. He has great political power, but of course he's always a puppet, an instrument of Rome. He destroys mighty men. He destroys saints. Well, you've got John the Baptist to begin with. How about the slaughter of the innocents when he's trying to kill baby Jesus? He's full of cunning and deceit. Yeah, well, he was deceitful. He was cunning. Jesus says, "Go tell that fox this." So he will rise against the Prince of Princes. You look at the Bethlehem, his opposition to the Prince of Princes. You look at the trial, his opposition to the Prince of Princes. And then he's broken in the end by no human hand. That's recalls Acts 12 when Herod is eaten with worms and dies. So I think that as well as any scheme that you do, it works to see Herod as this king of the bold face, as this little horn of Daniel 8. Then verse 26, the vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but Seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. So the prophecies in the second half of the book of Daniel treat the future at a level of detail. Think about this. I can't think of another prophet anywhere in the Old Testament who gives this kind of detail in his prophecies. When we come to the long vision of chapters 10, 11, 12, it's going to treat the long back and forth that goes between the north and the king of the north, the king of the south, the Seleucids of Syria, and the Ptolemies of Egypt. Those pieces of the declining Greek Empire war back and forth. That sequence in chapter 10, 11, and 12, okay, our modern minds begin to wonder because we go, oh, another war, another thing, another deal, another, he's up, he's down, he's in, he's out. This kind of detail would, though it would be of immediate comfort and interest to those who are actually enduring those times, centuries after Daniel writes. They're more difficult for us to access, we who live in other centuries. But the point here of God's supervision, and then the detail that God gives Daniel to talk about these events that are happening far into the future. I can't think of another prophetic book that gives this kind of detail at this kind of distance in time. Okay, now verse 27, I was overcome, I lay sick, and then I rose and went about the king's business. Remember, this vision comes in the third year of Belshazzar, and this is before chapter 5's handwriting on the wall, which happens on the last night of Belshazzar. And so here's 80-year-old Daniel, has this vision, gets this interpretation, writes it down. But then the next morning, after a period of being sick, he gets up and goes to work. He's still in the king's service, even though his standing has declined. Because remember that in chapter 5, Belshazzar doesn't seem to know Daniel or be aware of his talents. So that's the end of chapter 8, about all I have to say about that. Next time we will look at chapter 9, which is where we get into Daniel's 70 weeks. And boy, do the lots of prophetic interpretations abound. But I'll tell you what I think about it. So, see you next time.